The Psychedelic Report.
Psychedelic drugs
have played their part in America's long, strange trip toward an understanding of mind-altering drugs.
The psychedelic news.
Leading physicians, scientists, and experts share their wisdom about psychedelic medicines and healing.
50 years ago, psychedelic drugs were at the center of America's counterculture.
The brightest minds in psychedelic medicine. The Psychedelic Report.
We use the ketamine-assisted psychotherapy model that happens to have psychedelic effects that were not predicted when the drug was first developed.
From researchers to investors.
I think the biggest mistake we've made as a culture is the war on drugs.
To physicians to shamans and nonprofit pioneers.
Psychedelic drugs.
Recent research suggests some of them could have legitimate uses.
The psychedelic news
brings you diverse perspectives from the front lines of this exciting movement. The Psychedelic Report.
The Psychedelic Report was brought to you by Apollo Neuroscience and produced by Future Medicine Media. Welcome to the Psychedelic Report, your single source of truth for the psychedelic news. I'm your host, Dr. Dave Rabin. I'm a neuroscientist and psychiatrist trained in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy as well as MDMA-assisted therapy. Welcome back to the Psychedelic Report. It's your single source of truth for the psychedelic news. I'm your host, Dr. Dave Rabin. I am very excited to bring you another psychedelic report focused on new ways and old ways to access psychedelic states without taking any substances into your body. These are some of the major traditions that have existed for thousands of years that has become the theme of this year for the Psychedelic Report. Obviously, there is a lot continuing to go on and develop in the psychedelic drug world. We are waiting for MDMA on the desk of the FDA, which is very exciting news recently that MDMA trials are under review by the FDA. And they will be reviewed this year and hopefully be available and cleared this year for physicians to be using MDMA in clinical practice with PTSD. And we also have psilocybin and many other clinical trials with psychedelic medicines coming down the pipeline. But in terms of other new developments, while we wait for psychedelic medicines to be legally available, we have tools we can use right now. Tools that, again, have been around for a very long time and that many people in the Western world over the years have learned and been teaching to each other through different mediums like the Commune courses. My special guest today is a particular expert in different forms of healing tools and accessing psychedelic states using some of these natural tools. Jeff Krasno is CEO and co-founder at Commune, an online course platform featuring world-renowned teachers in integrative medicine, personal development, yoga, meditation, and social impact. I can tell you that I personally lectured and taught about neuroplasticity and how the brain heals with the Commune program, and it was one of the best teaching experiences of my career so far, and I really enjoyed it. And I sincerely hope that anybody listening who is interested in deep diving into neuroplasticity, learning, and anything else Commune has to offer around spirituality and the interface between spirituality, healing, and science, which is an exciting future and really the future of mental health moving forward into the 21st century that we're here to bring you all the news about on the Psychedelic Report. Jeff is also the host of the Commune podcast, which ranks in the top 1% of all podcasts. In 2008, Jeff created the concept for Wanderlust, a series of large-scale events combining yoga and wellness with the arts. Wanderlust grew into a global wellness platform with 65 events in 20 countries. In 2016, Jeff was selected by Oprah Winfrey to be part of the Super Soul 100 as one of the nation's leading entrepreneurs. Jeff, it's always such a pleasure to have you. I love our conversations, and I always learn so much. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me.
Oh, David, it's such a thrill to be with you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to connect with this incredible community that you've built and are continuing to build. I see you everywhere on the interwebs, and you are just an unbelievable articulator for this movement. So thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. And, you as well are an amazing articulator of some complex topics for people that I feel are often challenging to understand. And part of why I'm excited to have you here today is because we're talking about good stress and also, of course, bad stress and psychedelic states and how all of these things tie together. And you have an incredibly interesting and diverse background in your life, in music, in health and wellness, in investment, in community building. And now you have a course that's coming out on good stress. And I was wondering if you could start off by just telling us a little bit about what is good stress and what led you to developing this course.
Yeah, thanks, David. Well, I think it's important to delineate between good stress and the way that we experience stress in the modern age, right? So, primarily we associate stress with distress, right? And that is like this chronic IV drip of stress that we cannot turn off. And that is in response to the deluge of information that our brain is being forced to intake. And oftentimes, what's being deployed out there in the attention economy or the information ecosystem is literally designed to leverage our human negativity bias, keep us in this place of constant fear and anxiety and stress, such that we cannot bounce back to homeostasis, to equilibrium. And we're just in a chronic state. And obviously many people associate, that with, of course, the hormone, cortisol, but there's so many, downstream impacts physiologically and psychologically from being in that state. So good stress is really just flipping the script on this chronic distress. Good stress is actually akin to how we evolved as a species, right? So we evolved with very customary forms of stress, like periods of food scarcity, fluctuations in temperature, full immersion in nature. We didn't have shoes or comfy couches. We certainly had plenty of conflict, but we resolved that conflict with face-to-face communication and found ways to find homeostasis socially, right? And so really what good stress is the self-imposition, sort of the deliberate self-imposing of these Paleolithic stresses that align us back with our engineering and our biology. It's really amazing. The more I've learned about, physiology, for example, it's like we're actually designed to be fat. Like fat is adaptive, right? A little bit in the fall, because of course, our body's inherent knowledge knows that, winters follow is right around the corner and we're going to have to endure periods of food paucity. So we were designed to become a little insulin resistant at the end of the summer and to put on a little bit of fat, which is really just a repository of energy. But of course, now in our modern age, our culture has really hijacked our biology, and there is no scarcity really. I mean, I wouldn't say that there's no scarcity in the entire world around food, but primarily we suffer from overnutrition. So the surfeit of nutrient deficient calories and shelf-stable refined sugars and grains and all that kind of stuff is at our beck and call at every moment. And so in this sense, culture has hijacked our own engineering and we never experience any scarcity. So we become obese and there's so many downstream impacts psychologically, mentally, from metabolic dysfunction, et cetera. We can talk about some of those things, but really now we're in this position where we have to impose these forms of short, acute stress. So like one of those would be like fasting, intermittent fasting. So because essentially we evolved with food paucity, now we've got to self-impose that. So good stress really are these series of protocols that I developed or I would just say that I curated from interviewing about 500 different doctors, including you, numerous times. Over the last 5 years, I began to experiment and tinker with all of these different protocols. I became my own kind of N1 experiment and jumped into the petri dish of ice baths and saunas and light therapy, but also social experiments. I had about 30 conversations on Zoom with people that don't like me. That was interesting. We can talk about that, but that is under the aegis of like good, stressful conversations, for example. And I really have turned my psychological and physiological health around. I lost 55 pounds and I reversed my prediabetes and my insulin resistance, but just became a more vibrant person, recaptured an ability to actually focus and concentrate. I read, I think, a total of 0 books in 2017. Since then, I think I've read maybe about 500, 550. This has really become a source of passion in my own life because it is very, very personal. And, I kind of want to come out now and share a lot of this and talk about it because I see a lot of suffering in the world. And some of that suffering appears like really prosaic and boring, and anodyne because we've accepted it as normal. So like, I'm sure a lot of your audience, things like chronic fatigue and, brain fog and insomnia and irritability and, lack of ability to focus and, reliance on your digital devices for that stuff is just so normal now. But it's just upstream from all of the biggest chronic diseases, including Alzheimer's and dementia and mental illness. So, right. That's why I want to be part of the solution.
Yeah, I love that. Congratulations on all the incredible, transformations that you've personally had in your life by, really diving headfirst into this new ethos of life that you've discovered. I think that's testament in and of itself to the benefits of what we're talking about. And, it's always been really interesting to me as a scientist and a psychiatrist who has studied stress for a very long time, both in cells in culture and in whole, functioning human organisms and in communities, that stress we talk about it as something that's always bad in conversation, but stress is actually required for us to grow, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's so interesting, and how stress can be incredibly adaptive, really, if leveraged properly. And in fact, the self-imposition of certain kinds of stress actually trains us to become more able to move back into homeostasis, right? So like we want our heart rate variability to be up, right? Because that is a indication that we can have a healthy stress response. So there's things like, obviously like cold water therapy, for example, which is obviously amazing for, dopamine release. It'll actually, upregulate dopamine for up to like 48 hours, I think, after a session. But really, I think, what it trains us to be able to do is to apply, top-down conscious pressure on bottom-up involuntary responses. So if you're going to like immerse yourself in an ice bath, for example, you're going to have like a very normal endocrine kind of reaction to that, right? So you're going to have a lot of adrenaline and a lot of epinephrine coming up. You're going to feel a sense of panic. But then can you essentially create the mindset such that like tug of war between your neomammalian kind of hippocampal rational part of your brain can pressure down that old kind of limbic reptilian part of your brain, such that then you can overcome that feeling of panic. And this is why I think like the cold is such an amazing tool for stress regulation. And Dave meant like, I abhor the cold. I hate the cold. It is by far away my natural habitat. I like a warm, toasty room, but I do this every day because it begins to punctuate my life in other ways where I find a stressful situation will arise and I can have a healthy response to that particular stressful, challenge or obstacle. I mean, just yesterday, I was walking in the hills near my house here in Laurel Canyon in LA, and between me and my destination was a coyote, right? And I looked at the coyote. It was maybe 10, 15 yards away. And yeah, naturally my heart rate and my respiratory rate went up. Cortisol was secreting, sending glucose, to my extremities, ready to fight or fly. But I was able just to find that space between the stress, between the stimulus, and between the response, such that I could assess the situation. I'm like, that coyote is not really a threat. I'm just going to walk the other direction very slowly. The coyote disappeared. And of course, what happened to my stress levels? They just went away. I came back to homeostasis. I bounced back and my respiratory rate went down. My heart rate went down and I was back into my parasympathetic kind of homeostatic state. And I walked home, and that's an adaptive response to that kind of situation. The problem is, in modern culture, the coyote never leaves, right? The coyote is always on the path. And unless we can cultivate that mindset. And in a way, these good stress protocols, they're all specific, but what sits behind all of them is mindset, is really creating that space between stimulus and response, finding safety and security in the moment, such that you can assess a situation, like fasting, for example. It's one of the protocols. Yes, of course, condensing your eating window into an 8-hour window will have certain benefits, right? And of course, there's exceptions to these things. Everyone's bio-individual. If you're menstruating or pregnant or in menopause, you got to find the right recipe for yourself. But generally, if you consolidate your food within 8 hours, you're stimulating some repair pathways and autophagy and AMPK, and you're probably calorie restricting in some ways. So you can see some, metabolic upgrades there. But I think that the most important lesson I had from adopting the fasting protocol was a mindset attribute where between the stimulus, the hunger, and the response, the mindlessly walking to the refrigerator and, or the cupboard and getting a bag of chips, though you tend not to find those in my house, but whatever. There was a space, and within that space, I could ask myself, I could examine the nature of the hunger, of the stimulus, such that I would begin to delineate between a biological need and a psychological or emotional desire. And as I refined that skill, that mindset, I began to be able to apply fasting to things much more important in my life than food, to be honest, although food is very important, but to technology and Instagram and retail therapy and relationships and conversations, such that, I could say, hey, separate and delineate between what is a biological need and perhaps an emotional desire or emotional trigger. So I find this bidirectional unveiling, revealing the mind, right? That I believe is somewhat the definition of what it means, what psychedelic means, that you can find that kind of inside a lot of these physiological practices.
I think that's a great way to describe it. And, I really love the concept you mentioned, which is about experiencing things that have been uncomfortable for us in the past, like
like cold or extreme heat or fasting, right, and depriving ourselves of food for certain amounts of time is something that we have learned to feel as uncomfortable, right? Mm-hmm. And over time, what we are actually training ourselves to do with learning to adapt, learning to be resilient, discovering what we're capable of about ourselves, which for many intents and purposes is through a psychedelic experience, right? Because psychedelic means to reveal our mind to us. And so if we're learning things about ourselves, about what we're capable of, that we're capable of tolerating or managing or adapting to discomfort in ways that we didn't think we were before, we are in fact revealing parts of ourselves to us.
You're listening to The Psychedelic Report.
And many people who I know, myself included, who have done, real hot and cold plunge, like sauna cold plunge for extended periods and done the full protocol or done fasting for a long enough time, will tell you that it feels in a lot of ways often like a psychedelic experience, because you know that you're safe within that state. And so that safety in a lot of ways seems like it creates the fertile ground for learning from discomfort and adapting to it. And I would argue adaptation is probably one of our single most powerful skills as human beings that most of us have not well trained because we haven't learned how to or learned that it was important. But it's actually that adaptation muscle, which we also sometimes refer to as the resilience muscle, which is how quickly do I bounce back from something that is challenging or hard. A lot of that seems to be cultivated or nourished through knowing that we're safe in the stressful environment, right? And then when we know when we're safe, then stress can become good stress that is really about challenging us to grow and become better, stronger, faster versions of ourselves that are more adaptable and more resilient and more able to bounce back and tackle whatever comes our way. And then the other side of it is stress without that safe context, in a context where our safety maybe is not confirmed, it's in question, all of a sudden results in what we often call distress, which leads to chronic stress over time that is very, very uncomfortable and causes lots of anxiety and poor sleep and irritability and all these other things and downstream mental illness. And so I'm curious, as we're talking about this, how do you see, like, do you see these kinds of experiences that you're having with sauna cold plunge? And even before I get to the question, I think what this is actually about, because I forgot to mention this earlier, one of my favorite words is hormesis, right? Which is a word you know very well, when we talk about hormetic stressors, which comes from pharmacology and the medicine world, but it really means delivering a low amount of stress in a safe environment so that you eventually build tolerance to it, which is really what happens with discomfort. And so thinking about this term, do you see what you're doing with like sauna cold plunge or fasting as or even interviewing, and having conversations voluntarily with 25 or 30 people that don't agree with you from the outset? Do you see that as like a hormetic stressor, or kind of getting you into a mind-revealing kind of psychedelic state of mind?
100%. I mean, being in a stressed state, I described some of the kind of physical signatures of it before. One of the other elements of it that I didn't mention is a very narrow focus, right? So your aperture becomes very, very narrow, and for very good reasons, right? Because there is a biological imperative to survive. But if you're always in that state, then you do not have an openness, a creativity, a sense of connectivity. And so being able to move yourself back into a state of openness and trust and safety, that is I don't know if there is a more important skill, in the world to be able to do that. And, honestly, it's like the best most obvious example of hormesis is like resistance training. So you progressively overload a muscle, right? The microfibers tear in your biceps, and then you give them a little bit of rest, and then they heal, and then they hypertrophy, so they grow, right? So you're actually growing strength and resilience through a little bit of stress. Now, the key thing here, the key element is the dosage, right? So the dose makes the poison. And this is where, you have a tremendous amount of agency, so even with something like, ice bath or cold therapy, it's actually quite interesting because a lot of people ask me, well, like, how long do I have to be in the ice bath and what temperature does it have to be and all this stuff? And this is an amazing thing about the nature of it and the nature of the mind is that it's actually completely subjective, is that you can, the benefits are conferred anywhere that it feels a little bit uncomfortable. And of course, you don't want to get too cold because then you risk hypothermia. You don't want to get too hot either because you don't want to be hyperthermic. But so it's about actually playing with the dosage, in this particular case, the temperature and duration, such that you can, avail yourself of the benefits. And then, you can decrease temperature and increase duration as you go. So you play with the edges of the dosage to essentially maximize your capability to build resilience. And this is really true, not just for your physiology, but very, very much for your psychology. And for example, I think there's a very strong metaphor between like how we build our physiological immune system and how we build our psychological immune system. So I'm not an immunologist, but I know enough to be dangerous. So, you build, your immune system by low-grade exposure to pathogens, to viruses and bacteria. And over time, your immune system learns what those are and develops specific proteins, specific antibodies for those things, such that when they encounter them again in life, they have the defense mechanism. That's actually how vaccines, particularly the old school vaccines, were designed to work, right? They were designed to introduce a dead or attenuated virus into your system such that you had exposure to that and that you built antibodies and resistance to that. So there's very, very similarly, you can also build a psychological immune system or psychological resilience by just the right amount, the low-grade exposure to psychological stressors or insults. And believe me, I've been insulted enough times over the last 5 years that I have a pretty hardy psychological immune system. But, Skylar, my wife, often says, Jeff, you just got to eat some dirt because she grew up on a hippie commune and she ate quite a bit of dirt or really played outside a lot. And she, attributes her very, very resilient immune system, to that kind of exposure. And so we all have to eat a little bit of psychological dirt too. And this is certainly not to excuse or justify odious behavior and neglect and abuse and racism, et cetera. But in the right doses, the ability to actually, receive criticism or receive an insult, and you're going to have a reaction to that, but the ability then to bounce back again to the middle, to homeostasis, to equilibrium, to center, right? That is just an inestimable tool in your toolkit, and it's going to just serve you really well over time because, Dave, we exist within a matrix, within a web of relationships, and, everything worthy that's ever been done really has been predicated on our ability as a species to cooperate flexibly at scale. And in order to do that, we need a certain amount of what the Greeks called euthymia, like this unflappable sense of emotional regulation, to be able to move into conversations with a feeling of safety and security, and to create that set and setting such that we can actually solve very, very difficult problems. So I think, building our psychological immune systems is something that is a very profitable project.
Yeah, without a doubt. And it really makes you think about the term like stress inoculation, right?
Yeah.
So we're really
that's good. Yeah.
like we're giving you or us, like when you feel when like a simple example of this where you don't need anything from the outside, like a sauna or a cold plunge or anything like that is even, well, you could take a cold shower too, right? That'll do it. That's uncomfortable for a lot of people. And just rather than jumping to the, oh my God, this is so cold, I have to get out of here as soon as possible, but just letting yourself sit in there for a minute helps you realize that you're actually safe. And even though it's uncomfortable, that discomfort's going to go away shortly and that you're going to be fine. And then that trains your body to do what you said, which is bounce back to homeostasis, to our most balanced, even state. And this is reflected in the most common biometric that we track in all wearable technology that is a tracker today, pretty much, which tracks heart rate variability, which as you train your resilience, your bounce back ability, that goes up. And the higher your heart rate variability, the more likely you are to bounce back from stress. And the most recent studies of heart rate variability are so interesting because they show that if you have high heart rate variability, that is the greatest likelihood, you have the greatest likelihood of having a long and healthy life. And the folks in blue zones tend to have, in the Mediterranean, for instance, who live the longest, tend to have the highest heart rate variability. And so, this brings up a really interesting question around, how much of this is perception, right? How much of this is actually under our control? Because I think when we think about stress, good and bad, or distress and eustress and distress, we often feel out of control, right? Mm-hmm. Stress inherently kind of makes us feel like, oh my God, I'm totally overwhelmed. I don't know what to do in the situation. And I have a lot of anxiety, restlessness. I don't know what to do with. I have uncomfortable feelings in my body. I have uncomfortable thoughts in my mind, right? Or all at once. And very little about that makes us feel in control. And yet, there's this very interesting opportunity, I feel, when I work with patients, I see this a lot, which is an opportunity to change our perspective on how we see stress. And that if we decide to even just look at stress, look at the challenge we're facing right now from a standpoint of how can I learn and grow from this today, as hard as it might be, rather than why me or what's wrong with me that I have to face this challenge today, all of a sudden, it just totally flips everything on its head. And we're in the moment trying to problem solve and figure out and adapt. And we're really building those discomfort tolerance muscles, and we're bouncing back quicker and stronger than we were before. And that's what I've seen. And when I've studied, elite military and elite athletes and the Michael Jordans of the world, this is what separates them from the rest of us, which is that they thrive under stress and challenge, and they are excellent at reframing stress and challenge as growth opportunities. Can you talk a little bit about that and how relevant that is to the
so many different threads to pull on there, David? I think Billie Jean King said, pressure is a privilege, right? That was one of her quotes, and certainly we see, the world's greatest athletes like Novak Djokovic or whatever, he will have sort of an angry outburst, but he is kind of among the best. In fact, I would put him as the greatest of all time, even though I love my man Federer, because of his ability to essentially bounce back, that he always finds that awareness of the present moment such that he can always untangle a threat or stress and actually witness it as you might witness a thought or a feeling of or an emotion kind of within a meditative state. So, of course, that's what we want. That's what we're striving for, is that, you're seated and you're watching thoughts and emotions and feelings arise and subside moment to moment in consciousness, that you have a sense of that own awareness as being sort of the blackboard upon which all of this phenomenon is etched. And you are the sky, and all of these stressors and emotions and feelings are just clouds, right? Yes, that's where we want to get to for sure. But in the moment, how do we access that space, that sense of awareness? And a lot of that, of course, is through training when we are safe and secure, such that you can apply it when those moments of panic and a severe anxiety and acute stress, arise. And obviously, when we're very familiar with the notion of like our thoughts impacting the way we feel. So that is something that people, I think, can grok. We see a snake slither across the floor. We have that HPA response that we talked about earlier, like with a coyote. But I don't think people are as fluent or familiar with the sort of the bidirectionality of that highway, where oftentimes, our trauma or traumatic experiences are stored such that actually the feeling actually has its provenance, or the phenomenon has its provenance in our physiology. We start to have all of those like high respiratory rate, all those presentations of sympathetic overload, and in our body first. And then that actually permeates our thoughts. And we begin actually to then associate certain kinds of experiences with panic and anxiety. So I think what we need to do is build this toolbox. So for example, you're obviously incredibly well versed in the many, many, many techniques that are available to us. And, the agency where we, the places where we do have agency, for example, like the leveraging of the breath, for example, as a tool to move you from sympathetic to parasympathetic, to essentially, hack your subconscious activity, such that, you are basically almost tricking your body back into a place of homeostasis, right? There's a lot of these, different techniques. And I think this is why it's so important that practice is so important. I remember David G. Do you know him? He's like a meditation guru, just wonderful guy. And I was talking to him one day, and he's like, you can't crisis meditate. I'm like, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, you don't brush your teeth for 3 hours right before you go see the dentist and expect to have good results after not brushing your teeth all year, right? So, same thing applies with the training of your mind. You need to make some of these modalities a practice, such that, when you most need them, you can leverage them.
You're listening to The Psychedelic Report.
And, it's, I read this paper, you might be familiar with it. It's like, I think it was Harvard paper, Matt Killingsworth and Dan Gilbert, which is a curious name for a paper. It was called "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." I don't know if you read that, you're familiar with it. Yeah. But, essentially what they found was that the happiest people, the people that were most at ease, were the people that were actually thinking about the thing that they were doing. So they were yoking action and intention, right? And it wasn't so much that they were always focused on the thing, but what they had the optimal capacity to do was to always bounce back. So they would become distracted by something, but then they'd always come back to the action in the moment. And this is a great form of this, can inform a great kind of meditation practice that I talk about quite a bit called single pointedness of mind. It's a kind of very Zen concept, but essentially, you're watching thoughts and emotions and phenomena appear moment to moment. You see them come and go, and then you come back to your drishti or your breath or your mantra or whatever your single pointed focus is. And your capacity to always come back, that it's actually in the distraction that the opportunity lies, which is the amazing thing. Yep. And then you just keep coming back. And so these are the quiver or the arrows that we need to put in our quiver, particularly, in this day and age where everyone is vying for your attention at every moment. Your most marketable quality or is your time and attention, right? So, and again, this is very different in our modern culture versus, how we lived 10,000 years ago. So, we have to self-impose these kinds of things that feel stressful. And strangely enough, like sitting on your ass and doing nothing right now in this day and age is stressful. But it's a good stress,
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you're saying. I think I'm so glad you mentioned that meditation technique and the reason why it works for people, because I think it is also my favorite meditation technique, and I find that it is the ultimate metaphor of what we're talking about, right? Which is this idea that meditation it's not the means to the end. It's the means itself that matters, right?
Yes.
And the means is the process. And when it comes to attention training, again, going back to the other thing you said that is exquisitely important for everybody listening to understand, that modern neuroscience and psychology have now shown is in fact 100% true, which is that multi-thousand-year-old ancient knowledge from Eastern and tribal medicine, is that our attention is our single most powerful and important skill as human beings. And what we choose to pay attention to is literally what becomes us, and what we become, right? It creates the portal, the entryway, the opening to our consciousness. And so if we choose to give our attention to something that is not serving us, or it's outside of our control, or it's something that is uncomfortable or causes discomfort, then we will invite those things into our lives. If that thing happens to sap energy from us, it's basically inviting a vampire into your house, right? And then that vampire cannot come in unless we say, I'm going to pay attention to you, and that's the invitation, right? And the process of training that is a very interesting process because it is free. It's incredibly free. We have tools now like Apollo that can help, and music that can help. But the process of doing what you said is so important, which is just noticing, non-judgmental self-awareness of noticing, hey, I'm sitting here and I told myself I was going to pay attention to my breath, but now I find myself paying attention to something else that I'm distracted by. I can have two choices. I can keep paying attention to that thing, or three choices. I can keep paying attention to the thing that's distracting me. I can judge myself for paying attention to the thing that's distracting me, or I can just notice it, not judge it, and then redirect my attention back to my breath. And every single time we do that redirection back to the breath, that is the practice of meditation. That is the practice of attention control and strengthening those attention muscles that makes us less likely to be susceptible to all the crazy chaos that's going on around us every day in modern life, and brings more of our own sense of agency or self-control back to us. And the breath is so cool as an anchor in this process, because breath, I wouldn't say is tricking us into feeling we're safe and in control. It actually is that place we can always come home to, of knowing that we're safe and in control. Because if I have the time to take a breath and pay attention to that breath, then I can't possibly be running from a lion right now, because my body would evolve to not let me do that. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think attention may be the only kind of crack in the door for free will. And we won't get into a extended free will versus determinism conversation here, but if you just think of like, well, you didn't really choose your parents, right? So, you got a bunch of genes, you got a bunch of fixed nucleotide sequences and probably some SNPs and mutations in there that you've got to deal with. Your morphology and other things are set. You didn't choose what era you were born into or what country you were born to or what the politics were or, all these different elements of your environment. You didn't have that much control over the billions upon trillions of prior causes, these sort of like chains of events that led you to where you are, or the randomness and serendipity of life. You don't have control over any of those things, but where you do seem to have some control is where you put your attention moment to moment. And this is why, it's so important to take hold of this particular component of our agency. There's a neuroscientist. You may know him. His name is Adam Ghazali. Do you know Adam Ghazali? Yeah, he's a very interesting guy.
He episode coming out with him this year.
Oh, great. Okay, cool. So he had this metaphor that he created because if you feel distracted, if you're listening and you feel that paying attention or concentrating or focusing is difficult, don't feel bad about that, because I'm going to give you a metaphor here, which is, it kind of unpacks why it is so difficult in our society to hone those skills. So Adam Ghazali makes this wonderful metaphor. He's like, okay, our hunter-gatherer ancestors like go out onto the Serengeti and they're looking for food, and they come across like a wonderful fig tree, right? So what are they going to do with that fig tree? They're going to, avail themselves of all the figs on the shoulder-high branches, the ones that are most accessible, right? And then they're going to like climb the tree and get the ones that are like on the higher branches. They're going to be eating some as they go. They're going to be packing some back to bring back to the tribe for much celebration. And they're going to essentially devour that entire tree. Now, let's say, repeat that experience. You show up, there's a fig tree, but it's sitting in a giant grove of other fig trees. So what are you going to do? You're going to go pick the ones that are most accessible to you. And then you're going to like look over and you're going to say, that other tree is just like 10 feet away. And there's a bunch of figs I can grab really quickly over there. So you scurry over there and you take about 10 figs off that one. And then all of a sudden you look just like over your shoulder and there's another fig tree over there with some beautiful fake and luscious figs hanging right there to be able to grab. So you run over there and, the metaphor might be obvious here, but what he calls kind of the modern society is like we are information foraging in the same way that we are foraging for figs in a tops of trees, where obviously you're going to get served up. You don't sit in a comfy, well, let's not say comfy, you don't sit in a chair and read Moby Dick from cover to cover anymore. You get your information on a phone, and within the first paragraph of that article, there's a link to go out somewhere else. And then there's a link from that next article to go somewhere else. And you do this sort of like cost benefit analysis. And you're like, I think I got the gist of this one. I'm going to click out, and now I'm going to click out, and now I'm going to click out again. And of course, like the ad revenue media model is reliant on this kind of, lack of attention, right? And this kind of information foraging. And so, we all fall victim, to our culture all the time. On some level, we think that we shape the culture, but the culture often really shapes us. And that is the theory of structuralism anyhow.
But the culture shapes us until we realize our own agency.
That's right. Exactly. And this is why we have to self-impose these kinds of practices now, because we need to realign ourselves with the way that we were designed. We were simply not designed to take in all of this information and notifications and pings and dings and emails and Slacks all the time. We weren't designed for that. And so, okay, we can wait another million years and hope that we evolve to be able to like multitask like a computer, or we can simply change our behavior, use our agency to align ourselves with the miracle of our own engineering. And that's what I'm trying to do.
I really love the way you describe that. And, I think this is so just, this is a great point to end on, because I think the miracle of our own engineering is also feeling safe enough to embrace the unknown about life, right? Which is also the unknown. It's the unknown within us, which includes what we're capable of, the unknown that maybe we weren't taught about ourselves growing up, the unknown about our minds and our mind, body, spirit, how we think, how they're all connected, right? What's possible for us in this life. And then also the unknown for everything else around us, which often for many of us, we're under so much stress that newness and the unknown invites uncertainty and scariness, right? And so we just kind of are taught to reject it and try to cling to what's familiar. But it's actually the unknown that is what psychedelic states reveal to us most. And it's what these self-training techniques that we're talking about around stress, resilience, recovery, adaptation, attention control. Once you start to practice these techniques, and again, all the most basic ones are free, and you can start right now in the comfort of your home as you're listening to this by just starting to take a few deep breaths. Things start to come to you that you might not have noticed before. And that's a sign that you're entering into this beautiful place of the unknown, which is where all of our magical self-discovery happens. And self-discovery is one of the single most rewarding things that we can all experience as human beings in this life. And so, Jeff, I really appreciate you joining us to chat about this today.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. And I think what you were pointing to there at the end is actually getting comfortable with discomfort and comfortable with the ultimate unknown, which is really the fear of death. And if there is any target of a spiritual life or a self-examined life, it's freedom from the fear of death, of that unknown. And this is what the examination of the mind really is. This is why meditation and psychedelic practices, they're really tuning forks for reality, for objective reality, for the nature of the mind, such that we can become comfortable with discomfort. And it's ironic, because what that actually really leads to is true ease. Like real ease, not sitting on the couch eating potato chips, watching Netflix ease, but a true ease. And honestly, a comfort with the discomfort of things like death, honestly. And realizing that, we are just part of this kind of chain of captured sunlight. And we are made of the same elements that were forged in the crucibles of megastars 8 billion years ago. And that nitrogen and oxygen and hydrogen and carbon will move on. They will simply move on. And in that sense, you never really die. Your instruments, your sensory instruments may be coterminous with death. But I think to the degree that we can live this examined life and become comfortable with certain forms of discomfort, that will lead to a lot of ease. And that's what good stress has provided me.
I love that. And that is the goal, right? Ease is just being okay with things as they are, even though they may not be what we thought they were going to be. And the fear, letting go of the fear of things we can't control, right? One of my, Lauren Taus, one of my favorite colleagues. I think this quote may have come from her, it may have come from someone she was quoting, but there's a quote I love about this topic, which is that the biggest cause of death is life, right? So we might as well embrace it.
Right. We were all dead once. It wasn't probably that bad.
Right. And so we might, like, if death stops us, or the fear of the eventual inevitable death that will happen to all of us stops us from living and embracing this life, then we're missing the point, right?
Yes.
We're fundamentally missing the point, because we're not here to avoid death. We're here to die, but to live first. And so there's so much good stuff that came out of this conversation. As always, I'm so grateful again for your time. Can you just leave us with where folks can find you and find information about your course and anything else that you're excited to come out with?
Yeah, sure. Well, I do host a podcast, which for one reason only, and that's to bring me into the present moment. No, for many reasons. So I host the Commune podcast, so you can always find conversations there. A number of really just fascinating conversations that I've had with you. So that's on all podcatchers. And then, I'm waxing alternately poetic and pathetic on Instagram at Jeff Krasno. And this course can be found on Commune, which is my fourth daughter, I should say. And that's at One Commune. So that's ONE, commune.com is the website. And then /good stress is the specific course. And you can really take almost all of it for free. And that's my goal, is to democratize access to some of these practices and to bring it to the people that honestly need it the most and may get access to it the least. So that's been our mission at Commune, and it's my mission with this program. And both program and Commune are incredible opportunities, incredible places. I've had the distinct privilege of being able to teach there and spend time there over the years, and I just couldn't recommend it more highly as both an educational and a rejuvenating experience and place to be, to connect with amazing human beings who are genuinely curious and excited about life. And every time I go there, I always learn more about life and myself. And it's always just been an incredible experience. So thank you so much for doing that and for sharing your passion for health and healing with us and the world. And hope to do this again soon. Absolutely. I so appreciate you, Dave.
Thanks for listening to The Psychedelic Report. Visit us at thepsychedelicreport.com. This show is recorded weekly on Clubhouse with a live audience. The Psychedelic Report was brought to you by Apollo Neuroscience and produced by Future Medicine Media. While I am a doctor, I'm not your doctor. So please don't take anything you hear on The Psychedelic Report as personal medical advice, because we don't know you. If you have questions about anything you hear on this show, please consult with your doctor.